Hi, my name is Tom Linneman from the Sociology Department. Our department is fortunate to have an endowment put in place by the Schmidt family. Roberta Schmidt, William and Mary class of 1960, her husband Raymond Schmidt, and their son Douglas, who received his BA from William and Mary in 1984 and his MA in sociology from William and Mary in 1986. Doug subsequently pursued computer science and is now Associate Chair of Electrical Engineering and Computer Science at Vanderbilt University. The Schmidts are very interested in the impact of technology on individuals and society. Towards this goal, 11 years ago, we decided to organize an annual lecture on technology and society and use the Schmidt Endowment to bring to campus leading researchers on these topics. Today is the 10th annual Schmidt Lecture. In addition to thanking the Schmidt family, I'd like to thank Debbie Eck, our departmental administrator, who handled many of the details surrounding our speaker's visit to our campus. And she's promised, despite the weather tomorrow, you're going to get her home, right? Yes, yes. Debbie can do it. Given that we've been hosting this annual lecture for quite a while now, we've covered many interesting topics: the digital divide, privacy issues, digital copyright, activism, technology's influence on the work-home divide, children's use of social media, and police use of new media technologies. To this growing list, we add today's lecture on a topic we have never covered, never even close. Today's Schmidt speaker is Maria Dorfel. Professor Dorfel received her PhD from the State University of New York at Buffalo and is now an associate professor in the School of Communication and Information at Rutgers University. Professor Dorfel has conducted communication and network assessments inside organizations and in areas in which environmental conditions disrupt interorganizational alliances. Her research has been supported by grants from the U.S. Department of Defense, the National Science Foundation, and the United States Agency for International Development. By my count, she is the author or co-author of nearly 50 articles and book chapters. Today, she will offer some of the highlights from her work in the U.S. and around the world. Her talk is entitled, "Social Networks Disrupted: How Organizations and Communities Achieve Resilience in Volatile Conditions." In this age of nearly constant wars and environmental disasters, I can think of no more pertinent topic. Please join me in welcoming Professor Dorfel to our campus.
Thank you. What a really nice introduction. I really appreciate it.
I try.
Do you all hear me all right, or do I need to get additionally mic'd up? You're good. Okay, I see people in the back nodding. Thank you. So today I'm going to talk to you about the idea of technology and the way technology gets used, or maybe not so much used, among organizations that are trying to build relationships with other organizations. And I'll just, Tom already briefly introduced me a little bit. I've done this kind of research where I'm really interested in the ways in which organizations partner with others to effect some change or to deal with their own survival. They build these networks with others in order to have some outcome, right? And I've done this in various different contexts that are challenged in some way, whether it's because of war, because of natural disasters, and even most recently, which I won't be talking about today, even cybercrime and some online types of challenges that organizations are facing. So, as Tom mentioned, my research has been funded by various different organizations too, which incidentally, funding organizations have their own sets of networks that have an impact on society. And they use their own social media and technology tools that have an impact on society and an impact on the way in which they shape their public presence. Again, spoiler alert, not going to talk about that today. Instead, I'm going to talk about more exciting and fun things like buildings getting blown out by enemies who want to conduct ethnic cleansing. Doesn't that sound like fun? 4 o'clock on your Thursday afternoon, woohoo! What you're looking at here is a building in actually Sarajevo in Bosnia, where there was a 10-year bloody civil war among the various former Balkan countries, Bosnia, Croatia, Serbia, Yugoslavia, the former Czech republics. And there were incredibly bloody wars against essentially Muslims and Christians, and there was a lot of hatred going on at the time. And what you're looking at here is an apartment building where it was not only shelled with mortar and not only pillaged for all the valuables that were in it, but then also burned to the frame, to the cement frame. And what you see here are like the mortar shells, the bullet holes, and so forth. And the reason why it was burned to nothing is because they don't want you coming back, and they don't want your families coming back. You're done, you're out, right? Very volatile contexts. On another note, we start thinking about how do we deal with repairing this? How do we deal with getting back to normal and responding to and rebuilding a country that's been destroyed? I studied a lot about how that happened. Croatia had a lot of buildings like this as well. This one happens to be in Sarajevo, and it's the most dramatic one to really tell a good story of the ones that I snapped pictures of. I also did some research in Bosnia, though Bosnia was an interesting and complex story that continues to go on, and we're not going to focus on that today. But other contexts include this. I don't know if the lights can dim or not. It's tough to see that. Does anyone know what you're looking at there? Katrina, yeah. All the rooftops buried in water, right, in our own country. You know, and some sociologists might call this some sort of ethnic cleansing because there are differences on who lives in the high ground that don't get flooded in New Orleans. I won't be getting into social class issues today, but nevertheless, those are some serious issues that we face in our own country. But we also see it a little bit more local. So we had that first picture is that very macro point of view where you see that an entire community, an entire society is suffering, right? And then you focus in and get a little bit more close to the action. And you see piles of rubble from houses that were destroyed by winds, rains, and flooding, all right? And this was, by the way, I took this picture in 2005, in December of 2005, a few months after Hurricane Katrina hit. All right, and then you get up close. Up close, what you see here is one of my participants. I interviewed organization and business leaders about what they did, how did they leverage their social networks, and how do they use technology to get themselves back up and running and as a way of being part of their own broader communities. So in what I was doing, I was looking at these macro level problems and honing down into the very individual level of analysis of how do specific organizations do survival, how do specific organizations do resilience, right? What you're looking at here, interestingly enough, is his former office space, which had newspapers on coffee tables when he vacated New Orleans. And when he came back, the waters, he had 8 feet of water. When they came back and the water receded, those are the newspapers that became one with the floor. And I thought it was really fascinating, too, because it became a metaphor for what people in New Orleans were dealing with, which is that Katrina became one with who they are. Right? This is their story. This is their who shot, you know, where were you when JFK was shot sort of thing, right? And so how do you deal with this, right? How do you respond from this? And my interest is in leveraging those social relationships because we see so much of turning to other people for help when we need them, when we need help, right? And organizations do this too. And I talked with about 60 different organizations, businesses, ranging from small mom and pop to very large corporate businesses who were doing their work in New Orleans and trying to come back and trying to rebuild after the storm. And I talked to them about social networks. And so what you see here is this assumption about social networks. What do we get from having social networks, especially for organizations? We know that, first of all, we can talk about what social networks are, which are more than just Facebook, right? We've had social networks long before Facebook was around. But what do you do on Facebook? You engage with other people, right? So social networks are relationally structured. They're about relationships. Right? We look at social networks and we're trying to assess the degree to which actors are interdependent on each other. Especially for organizations, they go and they look to other organizations that might have joint goals and joint needs, and they will try to leverage those joint goals and needs to try to do better and do more work or make something they couldn't have done on their own, right? But they do have varying levels of commitment, they have varying levels of engagement. And they also have varying levels of the warmth of the relationship, the strength or the weakness of the tie. Networks tend to be very reciprocal. If I give to you, you'll likely give back to me, right? And they're relatively flexible. The idea of a network, especially in post-disaster or post-war scenarios, is that they're not waiting for a boss to tell them what to do. Networks are about being on the grassroots level, on the ground, and doing response and doing recovery on your own, right? Or at least in groups with groups of other people. And so they're both motivated by mutual benefits, and we see a lot of complementarity where partners can do what their other partners can't and vice versa. So they complement each other's needs and goals. All right. So in all of that talk, though, after disaster or after the devastating wars that can really eviscerate an entire country, we like to think about how networks can help us rebuild and be resilient. And networks are a very strong component of the idea of resiliency and of the idea of being able to enact resilience, right? Resilience is not just some end goal or thing, it's a whole process, all right? And when we think about networks, though, we're valuing the idea that they're dynamic, that they're flexible, that we can use them to access resources. And networks can be connected through weak ties, not just your besties, not just your family members, right? And then lastly, networks are emergent. In other words, what's the problem? Let's join forces based on what the problem is, rather than planned like an organization, like William & Mary's, a bureaucracy that's planned. We know what to expect in terms of delivering education. We know what to expect in terms of what our faculty should be doing. And so those are planned. Bureaucracies anticipate what needs to be done and have plans and structures and hierarchies. And so why do I have these next to each other? Because, of course, resilience is not just about one or the other. And in fact, when I was in Serbia, post-war Serbia, I was doing some workshops and helping to facilitate media organizations like newspapers and TV build alliances, strategic alliances with other organizations that were in the business of doing human rights, right? And in the business of human rights, they're interested in things like, gee, in a democracy, we don't want our journalists to be beat up. Because sometimes in emerging democracies, journalists, their lives are at stake because they're revealing things that people that don't want to be watched are saying, and that can be physically dangerous for that type of profession, right? So building those relationships and going to Serbia and doing this intervention where I was helping them find joint projects that they could do so that the media could find ways to get money in order to do their business, but then also work in ways to collaborate to protect their lives, because nonprofits, by the way, that they were working with know how to get money. Media, the journalists didn't know how to write grants and so forth. So I was running this workshop, and one of my newspaper owners raised his hand and said, you keep talking about these social networks as our opportunity to find and leverage resources. But here in Serbia, all we want is what's on the right. In our country, all we want is a stable bureaucracy. All we want is predictability in our government. All we want are resources, to be able to trust in where those resources come from and trust in the government and those that are running the country. And all we want is something that's designed and planned so it's a predictable environment. And incidentally, that really shines the light on how we have to, as researchers and as people going into the world who might be doing resilience work in your future careers, have to think about what are the real challenges we have. In the US, sometimes we use networks to work around bureaucracy. In Serbia, sometimes they use networks to survive from being attacked and whatnot. But they're together. Both are operating at the same time. So I'll give you a couple of specific examples. Yeah, I'm going to skip through this. This is for the faculty in the room who want to see the various different theoretical frameworks that I use in my research. But essentially what you see on the right here is the inverse pyramid, is where we're seeing those multiple layers, much like the picture of the flooding roofs. down to the middle ground of the pile of rubble, to the very local, the individual who is impacted. That inverse pyramid shows you theories that move from looking at what individuals do in organizational networks, the middle level of where we start looking at groups and the way networks get clustered around different subgroups within them, and then this more macro level of where whole networks tell us a story about how information and communication flows through it and around a system. Okay, but mostly what I'm interested in is the way in which we use networks to leverage manage turbulence and deal with these environmental threats, whether the environmental threats are war, disaster, human-made, man-made, and so forth. And we start thinking about this idea of resilience being kind of behind the scenes of these theories. And we can start thinking about, well, what does resilience look like? We know it's not a thing. Ask anyone who's been through a really bad snowstorm or 10 days of no power or through Hurricane Katrina. Even the person who is hurt the most will say, oh, we were resilient. Someone else had it worse than me. So we all psychologically think about resilience, right? But it's not a state, it's a process, all right? So here we go back to networks then. What does a resilient network look like? We see different network configurations all around us. If you think about it in your friendship circles, we'll get away from organizations right now. This network in the bottom right, you might think about that as your family, friends, your besties. That's a very tight, densely connected network and typically has people who deeply trust each other. There tend to be common norms and values. There tends to be loyalty to those networks, right? You're willing to count on each other, and you also can answer each other's questions, right? You know what each other is thinking. In those densely connected networks, there are great things about loyalty and trust and deep caring for each other. There can be risks in those types of structured networks in that you end up having finite amount of information because you all start answering each other's questions, right? You know the type of resources, whether it's information, knowledge, money, you know what each other has, and it becomes finite. Moving up here, that's a highly powerful, a highly centralized network where the person or the node in network parlance at the center has the most power because of where they fall in terms of the information patterns, right? It's a classic hub and spoke network. This network is a bit more distributed and it's considered decentralized, where it has what Ron Bird, a famous sociologist who works at the University of Chicago, has talked about in terms of it has a nice balance of structural holes. So each of these ties helps facilitate information to move from one end to the other, all right? And then we start having networks like this. Well, there is no network. There are no relationships there, because remember the initial slide is based on this idea that there's some level of interdependence, right, and connectedness. So this is maybe a potential network, or maybe it's a bunch of people that just can't stand each other anymore. Who knows, right? And then we have one that maybe is moving into a potential network. We're starting to see ties get realized. Or maybe these are networks after a disaster when no one can communicate with each other because they're cut off from each other. So this is a theoretical array of ways in which networks might be constructed and the ways in which they might be very central around one node that's in charge, or decentralized where no one particular person or organization in the network has more power than another, all right? Versus a network like this, which is very densely populated. Think about this too in terms of communication flows. You're so busy maintaining those relationships, you don't have time to make new relationships, right? But again, these are theoretical frames, and we use these theoretical frames to try to understand, well, what are the ideal structures that our organizations should have? Because inevitably, I've got, on a very practical side, professionals say to me, Maria, what's my communication checklist? What's my network checklist? What does my network have to look like so my company, my organization can be more resilient? Or for the community action groups, what do we need to do in terms of leveraging our relationships so that we can get the collective action problems that we have solved, and so that we can get goals accomplished? What should they look like? Well, here are the theoretical ones. Of course, there's no straight answer. It depends on what your goals are and what your needs are, but each of them has different values to them. But let's go to some basics then about resilience. So what is resilience? Resilience is about these ideas of robustness, or the idea that we can manage stress without loss of function. You can keep on plugging along, and there can be some recognizable traits of the organization doing its business. In post-New Orleans, for example, organizations that had robustness were able to still do work even though they were displaced. So think about modern knowledge work or information work and so forth. There's also this idea of consistency and ongoing partnerships. There's this idea of resourcefulness, where we identify problems, we know how to establish priorities, mobilize resources, and network flows, like that middle network I showed you, help facilitate this sort of resourcefulness, all right? And then rapidity is about this idea of being able to meet goals effectively and efficiently. And network structures that have a balance and broker information through the network can support this, all right? There's also, though, redundancy, which is a little different. We're not seeing a balance of structural holes then. What we end up seeing then is in redundant networks, we see lots of ties that do the same thing. So for businesses, for example, you might not want only one supplier, because what if that supplier goes out of business, right? So in our various different partnerships, if you have multiple partnerships doing the same thing in your network, you've got redundancy, so if one goes offline, you've got another available to you, all right? That takes work for organizations, and it takes capacity to keep up with that, right? And then we also see this idea of external availability, which is where we start talking about the use of ICTs, or information and communication technologies, whether those are your mobile devices, your phones, or like, you know, at industrial plants, they might have walkie-talkies or that sort of thing, or whether we're talking about social media, texting. Those information communication technologies help us to reconnect, and they also help us to be available so others can come to our rescue or come to help us as well. So it's a two-way street that the information communication technologies help us. And across all these factors, the more you have these factors, the more resilient your processes appear to be, okay? So this comes from organizational research. This comes from studying high reliability organizations. This also comes from post-disaster research. And now we start talking about, by the way, the external availability there. That came in as a result of the work that I did in Hurricane Katrina, where cell phones and technology facilitated two-way flows of communication. And oftentimes when the victims actually couldn't reach out, others had reached out to them, and it gave them a chance to receive resources. But I'll get into that in a minute. So anyway, so back to the sunny side of this talk. War and pillage, ethnic cleansing, fun. We have different networks that we tracked in Croatia. So 2000 was the first time that we went and visited the city of Zagreb, where a lot of the transformative work was being done to move Croatia out of a totalitarian state into a free and fair democracy. And the US had a lot of interest in getting this done. The US was sending a lot of money to Croatia to help facilitate this. Who was getting that money? These organizations. New media, I don't want to say new media organizations like TV and newspaper, the news media themselves were for the first time not the propaganda tool of the totalitarian state. They were freed media to do the reporting that we recognize in democracies. We used to recognize in democracies, right? Objective media. And so these folks are nonprofit organizations that are grassroots organizations interested in figuring out how to make their communities better. They have different missions like human rights, animal rights, children's rights, environmental concerns, right? So we have these very different grassroots organizations that have these mission-based interests, but they also know they have a vested interest in making sure their first elections that would happen in 2000 actually go off, and that they would actually be able to see a democracy happen. Because without a democratic state, they're not going to be able to do the mission-based work that they're able to do as effectively and efficiently and and have some impact, right? So the United States, USAID, British Fund, George Soros Institute, these are international donors. They're large donors who are interested in seeing democracy building around the world. And they filtered money into this situation. And so in Zagreb, we went in and looked at the movers and shakers, those organizations that were on the ground trying to help citizens who had no idea what it means to do democracy, try to educate the citizens to learn how to vote, to understand what it means to be engaged in the democratic process, and to ensure that they were going to have free and fair elections, all right? And so this is what that network looked like. And as you see, it's almost irrelevant. The types of organizations I told you about include those NGOs, the nonprofit organizations that I just mentioned, also various different new media outlets, all right, as well as those funders, those big funders. So we see a fairly dense network, right? This is a time when there was a lot of uncertainty. And this dense network was very functional for Croatia. And these participants, these organizations that I tracked and visited and talked with and interviewed about their relationships with each other, had a lot of confidence in each other. They spent a lot of time interacting with each other. And they spent most of their time doing so in coffee shops, in face-to-face forums, and sometimes on the phone. In 2000, we didn't have social media per se. These organizations didn't really have websites. There wasn't Twitter. There wasn't Facebook. So it makes sense that they weren't exactly like, geared up with their technologies. But they didn't really use the conventional forms of technology to interact with each other. They were doing most of their work in face-to-face relationships or over the phone in very rich media environments. Then cut to 2002, notice the network starts to look like it's breaking up, right? It's a little bit less dense. They're shifting their orientations, right? And now is that good or bad? As the researcher in trying to understand resilience, is that going to be good or bad that we're starting to see fewer ties in that network? What do you think? And then by 2004, even fewer ties. Same actors at each point in time. By 2004, I'll give you a spoiler alert. You guys are energized on your Thursday afternoon. By 2004, Croatia is now applying to be part of the EU, right? And going to be getting the euro as part of their currency and being part of the whole trade agreements of the various different European countries, all right? This network, although it appears like it's breaking up, what's also happening is over time, the country as a whole is starting to feel more certainty. They're starting to feel that democracy is intact. And in fact, Croatia is a strong democracy right now. They have a good economy. If you haven't been there for traveling, it's a fantastic country to travel to, right? It's along the Dalmatian coast. It's great, right? And so what happens is we have to scale out and say, so what else is going on here? Are these organizations actually no longer talking to each other because of disinterest or because they don't need to? And the answer is they really don't need to. So now you're looking at something different here. At this point in time, right, the network, I'm asking them, who are you talking with in terms of your core network of movers and shakers, right? And they're saying, not so much anymore. So I ask, who else are you talking with? Who are your new partners? And this network is now what's called a two-mode network, right? It means the organizations that I interviewed are the red one. No, the blue ones. No, sorry. The organizations I interviewed are the red ones. The blue ones are the ones they named as these are the partners that we're working with these days. And part of our questions and our interviews and our visits were about trying to understand, what are you doing now to maintain civil society? In 2000, we were asking, what are you going to do and who are you working with to make sure democracy happens? And then our questions kind of had to change a little bit over time too. What we actually see is a story of a very cohesive network where they're mobilizing and they're working with each other and they're complementary in a highly uncertain situation, right? Moving to a less mobilized, moving to somewhat of a centralized network where incidentally this organization is this one here, right? And this organization ends up being the core grassroots network that came to have such a strong reputation as being the leaders of their movement and those that really made a difference to help Croatia see their democracy happen. It's called GONG. It's an acronym in Croatian for like how to be a Democrat, or how to be in a democracy or something like that, right? What you see over here is those funding agencies that used to be right in the middle too and right in the mix of things, and then start moving further to the periphery, and then further to the periphery where they're not getting connected anymore. Now they're totally not connected. That's the British fund, that's USAID. They're listed twice because they're mentioned twice. If you want to ask about this later, ask me later. But nevertheless, and we also see where I'm sorry, I've lost where my George Soros was. But nevertheless, this is a successful campaign of moving organizations out of having to rely on each other just to make democracy work and to deal with lots of uncertainty, to now seeing an opportunity to build new partnerships. And so what those, especially like the nonprofit organizations that are interested in human rights, environmental concerns, children's rights, and so forth, they are now turning to other like-minded organizations to try to actually do the work of their mission, as opposed to trying to do the work of making sure that they have a democratic country to live in to begin with. So their goals shifted. So it was very much this network that was dynamic, emergent based on what the goals were, and evolved over time as the needs changed over time. Croatia is a great case, a successful case of how do networks change and evolve over time as resilience gets built up. By the way, if you ever read these papers, I don't use the word resilience in these papers. Resilience is kind of a new word being thrown around and used in academic writing. Then we move to the Afghanistan media sector. Afghanistan, after the Taliban was kicked out, in theory, by George Bush after 9/11, had a new sector of media organizations that they could actually do the work of journalism and not just being the arm of the Taliban and doing propaganda, right? And so what you have here is you're looking at similar types of situations, right? Where you've got organizations working together, trying to figure out how to do what they do. They're learning about how to be a media sector. And what does that look like? So these organizations include the news outlets themselves, plus news like education outlets that train journalists, plus journalist associations, plus external organizations like USAID, George Soros Fund, and so forth, plus external, like the BBC is here. So you've got local grassroots types of media outlets, plus international media outlets, plus one media outlet, which is called Moby. It's kind of like the Clear Channel Productions. They own every radio station in the country. Very big, powerful media company, a media conglomerate. So this is what the Afghanistan media sector looked like when I did research on, well, how are you leveraging your networks to figure out what it means to have a media that's not just the propaganda tool of the government? And what are you doing to learn about your craft? And what are you doing to advance and to survive in a volatile context, right? Because Afghanistan is not a safe place to be, right? And this is what they're doing. And I could show you a couple of more points in time, and it still looks like this, right? A lot of uncertainty, high volatility in the broader system, a lot of interaction with each other. Even though a lot of these organizations themselves are competitors with each other, they're still collaborating and cooperating and trying to figure out survival with each other. And incidentally, some interesting things, that organization Moby Group ends up being a very central, powerful leader in this network, at least according to the organizations that rated Moby Group as central and important and necessary in their movement, in their ability to do what they're doing. When I was commissioned to do this work by a nonprofit journalism training organization called Internews, and when I gave them this network and told them, oh, Moby Group and a couple of others are really highly valued here, they were floored. They were floored because Moby Group, they said, oh my gosh, they're so arrogant. Everyone hates them. This doesn't make any sense. Why are they saying that? They're assholes, right? Like they didn't know how else to describe it, right? And I'm like, what's going on? So we did some more work and we started realizing, This is the conflation of volatility. Moby Group is a huge conglomerate that has a lot of power and resources. And even though a lot of these organizations were small and not doing a great job yet, and they weren't getting the same market share that Moby Group has, they saw Moby Group as foundational to their ability to do what they're doing because they were the big guy in the network. And they had resources, so as long as they were doing news and doing journalistic reports and being objective and reporting on bad things and good things going on in Afghanistan, if they were doing it, then if Moby was doing it, then they could do it too and feel safer doing it. So centrality in networks, especially when we're talking about organizations and the importance and the leadership role that comes with that, can also come with the fact that some organizations are early entrants into a system or because they have a lot of resources and capacity to be able to do the business of media delivery, or news delivery in this case, in volatile environments. So it was kind of counterintuitive, so they weren't loved, and it's a little different thing than interpersonal networks. If you don't like someone, you're not going to talk to them anymore, right? I mean, what's the saying? Once bitten, twice. Once you hurt me. I'm horrible with these colloquialisms, but right. Once someone is mean to you, you might forgive them and give them a second chance. But after that, if they continue to be jerks, why would you give them time? At the organization level of activity, even though these are people that are working together on behalf of their businesses, even if there's a bad reputation or this, Moby in this case, they're not that friendly and they're not that helpful, but they were seen as very important to survival in this network. Nothing much has changed though, right? So what I know from this is resilience can also look very clustered, like that bottom right network that I showed you, that very dense network. You're building trust, you're relying on each other, you're trying to survive together, all right? Incidentally, this media use chart shows us that in Afghanistan too, just like in Croatia, they are not using any social media. Partly, there's a problem with reliable electricity and power there. Although Kabul, which is one of their major cities, does have fairly reliable infrastructure, their internet goes out all the time. All of these networks that I've been showing you, like this here, are based on face-to-face, coffee meetings, phone calls. They're not using, this bar chart shows you these low points here. In each of the cities where we collected data, they're not using much other than face-to-face and phone calls to connect with each other. So anyway, so we start seeing these reflections on civil society and instability, and we could make these comparisons between Croatia and Afghanistan. Let me see, what did I want to say here? So we start seeing dependencies between these organizations. Some of the interesting costs that can happen is this word, and hopefully you're learning this in your classes, but as networks, even though we value and celebrate networks for being dynamic and emergent, and they should shift as the needs shift, they can come to be reified, meaning networks can become to be as stiff and rigid as a bureaucracy, as the hierarchy that is the organizing social structure inside bureaucracies. Because what happens in that highly dense clustered network is we start seeing norms of conformity, norms of loyalty, and additional needs for capacity to maintain those relationships. You need time and energy and effort to maintain those relationships. And so ironically, although networks can be our friend, they also can be just as rigid and difficult to change as a bureaucracy is difficult to change, right? So now, but given this slide, where what's going on, now let's move over to the United States and talk about natural disasters and the use of social media, all right? And this opportunity of what happens when you're geographically dispersed. You're in a volatile situation, but not volatile. It's not a bloody 10-year civil war here. It's not Afghanistan, but my goodness, it is volatile. Talk to anyone like the person whose newspapers are now a part of their floor. It is volatile, but not volatile, right? But what's going on then? And part of why I say it's volatile, but not volatile too, is issues of trust, is who's listening to our conversations or who's watching our emails or our Twitters or whatever. So, but we're also starting to see, can technology be transformative in helping us survive disasters? Can we now see that technology has really changed from, especially communication technologies, from one-to-many or just one-to-one to networked, right? You text your friend, but you can also do group texts now, right? Or if you do a tweet, then you're revealing your point of view to a whole network of people, right? So now social media is transformative in the sense that it's moved from kind of a instrumental thing in the way we can stay in touch with each other to it's revealing who we connect with on a regular basis. And so we ask this question too at the organization level. Is that the case, and does that apply for organizations? And so we move to that New Orleans and organizations surviving. This is the density of the networks and how they changed over time for organizations that were reaching out. And it's the lines that you're looking at are reflective of my participants in New Orleans who reported on how they were using media to reach out to their network or to just engage with their network. And what you see here is this. Some of my contacts primarily were coded, they tended to just use established communication technologies. In other words, face-to-face, because so many of them were evacuated to Houston, they'd bump into each other on the street. And phones, they would borrow phones or use their own phones if their cell phones ended up working. Then they also, other organizations tended to use more common technologies, and there's a lot of details to why I labeled these as such. But they're a little bit more interactive style technologies, like not phone talking, but texting on the phone. You guys might not remember this, but in 2005, just the kids were doing texting, right? And so owners of businesses suddenly discovered texting because it was the only thing that worked on their mobile phones. And I can't tell you how many business owners said to me, oh yeah, I saw this thing on my phone, and it was the old clam flip phones, not a smartphone by any means. And I didn't know what it was, and my kid told me it was a text message. And that's how they all of a sudden got drawn into, oh, this new way of communicating. It was common to some, new to others. And then there were also, at the time, we didn't have Facebook. It was not at all ubiquitous yet. But we did have blogs. So blogs were counted too as kind of common technologies. But then innovative technologies were a little bit more of the people that were trying to be on the edge and ahead of all of that, right? So innovative technologies included more dynamic websites, right? Use of, I don't remember, use of more dynamic types of interaction tools that could facilitate organizations connecting with others. Some of my participants pretty much only used innovative technologies. They were early, like I think, what was it? Not Facebook, MySpace, right? They were using that, right? And then there were some that really did do a mix of these three. And here's what we see. Their social networks before Katrina looked like this. That's common technologies. The green is innovative users. The purple is those who used a mix of technologies, and the blue is those who used just established old school face-to-face and phone calls, right? And of course, Katrina hits, their networks drop down. The density of their networks, it falls apart. They look like the left side of that screen, right? And then of course, they start rebuilding their networks. But here's what's interesting. The mix is the most quick way to rebuild density in your network. The green, those that tended to only use innovative technologies, it was not as fast. Why is that? They're using, a corporate owner is using MySpace to reach out and tell people what's going on. They might not have friends that are on MySpace, right? These are interactive technologies. You need others to use the technology in order for it to be effective. So it's a really important lesson learned for organizations to really think about, okay, you might be at the head of the pack in terms of using the coolest, hottest technologies, but what are you missing if you're not using a mix of them? Right? And then the same sort of thing happened with building brokering ties. Building out weak ties, we saw a similar sort of pattern happen. So what happens is we see that the information and communication technology used post-Katrina facilitated connection, coordination, and creating a context, right? Creating this context that they felt safe to return to work. They felt safe to return to New Orleans, and that they knew that they could go back because others were going to go back. So those technologies helped them feel confident that their networks would be there if they go there, right? Think about the incredible challenge of after an entire city is evacuated, who goes back first? The individuals who want to get back to their houses, or the employers who make sure the individuals have money to pay for their houses and their repairs, right? It's a very tense time, right? Technologies also helped in terms of the technologies being more interchangeable, and they helped organization leaders be more innovative in how to reconnect. My most successful returners, those that I interviewed and that were really back online and back to work most quickly, were using mixed technologies, and they were very innovative. Recall that slide on what does it look like to be resilient. They were being innovative, and they had all those other features too, like being robust and resourceful and so forth. And so we found that these communication technologies were instrumental in helping them reintegrate into the work mode and rebuilding mode. And so we start seeing here the important issues of technologies helped facilitate, the organizations did that stuff too, but technologies helped my organizations to facilitate being available to receive support, whether it's information, financial support, and so forth, and also that they engaged. And engaging is something different. It didn't rely on your best friends. They received support through others who wanted to engage and help them. It didn't necessitate you to even know another person very well, but rather to meet others who wanted to help problem solve. So think about engagement this way. It's a little bit different from whether you have a strong liking or affect for another person. Have you ever walked down the hall and said, "How are you doing?" Do you stop and wait for an answer? No, you don't engage. You just say, "Hey, how you doing?" and you move along, right? And that can happen with a weak tie or a strong tie. But if you stop and wait and hear an answer, and you start actually talking about how your day is actually going, you've facilitated an engaged interaction. And you can have that in line at the grocery store, and you can have with a stranger, you can have that kind of engaged interaction with a best friend, right? What successful and resilient organizations found was this ability to extract support and help and engage. And so they were able to have these spontaneous networks that were present, and then they might go away, but they were these moments of engagement that they experienced, and they often discovered it through technology. So for example, the Children's Museum of New Orleans got a spontaneous call from someone they didn't even really know. They just knew each other existed because there are children's museums all over the country. And they got a call from a children's museum in Florida who had a similar devastation when Hurricane Andrew hit them. And they said, "We've been there. We know what to do." So they spontaneously created this tie. How did they find each other? Through technology, right? And then how do you leverage that? So kind of fascinating. So the lesson learned then is, oh, and by the way, Hurricane Katrina, I will keep this here. That's the Red Cross in the middle. The Red Cross had a lot of egg on their face, right? They were really, and FEMA also, were really critically attacked after Hurricane Katrina happened because they seemed very disorganized, inept, and unable to deal with the ongoing trouble on the ground. They were being bureaucratic in their response to a disaster, not networked in their response to a disaster, right? And the Red Cross and FEMA learned a lot of lessons actually, and they shifted from this mode where they weren't engaging stakeholders, they saw themselves as the center of a stakeholder network where they had each of these different partners, and notice this doesn't look like a network because none of these partners are connected to each other, right? So what we've learned is that we've shifted our mindset to where now the Red Cross recognizes that there's a network. This is the network of disaster response after Hurricane Sandy hit the coast of New Jersey, all right? And what we see here is on one side of the network, the grassroots responders, nonprofits, local businesses, collaborating and help each other to survive. On the right, we see first aid, we see ambulance, we see the school boards, we see the bureaucratic response. There are precious few connections, believe it or not, between these two sides of the network. And in fact, what was happening with the left side of the network is they weren't actually networking with the right side of the network. They were having clash with these bureaucratic institutions that really tried to reconnect themselves as a network, but they were still having bureaucratic answers to how to handle on-the-ground problems. And what was happening too, though, is they are dealing with their own reputations, like Red Cross, like FEMA. Their reputation is to what? To come up and save us when we're a national disaster zone, right? But what happens is when an entire community or an entire region is literally blown out of the water and literally flooded and has no power, no infrastructure, and everyone needs a piece of them, the Red Cross and FEMA have reputations that are so big and relied upon that they're going to fail, right? But it's a public relations problem. Their job is not actually to do all of that work. They have reorganized themselves. Since Katrina, they have built a structure called the Office of Emergency Management Structure, where they do nest national, state, regional, and hyper-local levels of organizations that work together as part of the Office of Emergency Management in collaboration with those on the left, the mayors and the firehouses and the police, to do better response and recovery, because they know FEMA and they know the Red Cross can't do it all, and they never were supposed to do it all. But by the way, they should do a better job communicating what they are supposed to do, because they still have this reputation, and we still anticipate that they're going to swoop in and save the day, when in fact that can't happen. So anyway, where's the future of resilience? What's really exciting is there's a new emergent area of work that sociology majors, communication majors, psychology majors are doing, urban planner majors. It's called resilience work. We see resilience officers popping up in towns, in businesses, in corporations, in nonprofits, right? And they're doing this thing called resilience work, which is social. It's the work, it involves people who are experts on and understand social structures, the opportunities and constraints that come with networking and working around bureaucracies and so forth. And so we start asking ourselves too about, so how does technology and organizing come together and help facilitate more smooth transitions, whether it's out of these war zones or facilitating collective actions to transform countries, or whether it's out of and responding to disasters. And we see that technologies can be instrumental, but really the question might be, especially if you're interested in studying technology in and of itself, is how do technologies become transformational, right? Not just as an instrument of how do we connect to each other, but do they actually have an impact on and transform our lives? We don't know that. We're starting to have scholars think about that, but for organizations, right now, organizations seem to still be using technologies very instrumentally as tools. It's not necessarily transformative, because it does sometimes take a long time for organizations to change their practices. All right, and I believe I've wrapped it up. There's my depressing slide again of the floors. And on that, we have to start asking ourselves too, when are networks flexible and doing the thing of dynamic networks should? When do they become too reified and stiff? And what sorts of activities can we do as people, individuals, as organizations, as leaders to make sure to embrace that flexibility while working along with the hierarchies and structures and recognizing the support that hierarchies and structures bring us? And I believe that is it. Thank you. And I love the green. We don't have green in New Jersey yet. Love it.
Yeah, that's a much prettier image to
Yes,
go out with.
yes, I'm positive.
Let me grab this real quick.
Sure.
Time for just a few questions, if anyone has.
Oh, sorry, walking right in front of you.
Well, I'll start.
Please do.
We're all so reliant on these technologies now.
Mm-hmm.
And could that bode poorly for us in a disaster? The most practical example I can think of is I don't have anyone's phone number memorized anymore.
No, none of us do.
None of us do. So is our over-reliance on these technologies, could that actually be a negative?
Yeah.
If your phone goes dead, you're helpless.
Yeah,
Completely helpless.
and it is a problem. It's a really good question because it's actually some of my future work now is collaborating with computer scientists and engineers. The engineers study hard infrastructures like our power, like our cell service, and the computer scientists study the programming that keeps those things alive and working. And we're trying to understand that as interdisciplinary work, right? Because we have become so reliant on it. And actually, even when we don't have the technology available, at least in post-Katrina New Orleans, we saw the loaning of technology. So we're so reliant on it, but when people from New Orleans had to vacate, and they didn't yet discover that texting worked still, cell service didn't work, but texting worked, even though even the satellites in New Orleans were flooded. If you had a 504 area code though, you all but figured your phone wasn't working. But they would vacate to Baton Rouge or Houston, and they would borrow the phone. So their phone they could still power up and get their contact list, even though they didn't have service. But there was this effort of loaning technologies. And so we are seeing like offices of emergency management now make sure part of their backup plan is they have cell phones that aren't their area's area code, meaning it gets filtered through different cell towers. Organizations and businesses keep their servers in different places. A lot of companies that have the capacity, in other words, money, to support it will have servers like New Orleans organizations. Oftentimes, they first of all put their primary servers above flood levels and also have secondary ones in Chicago and other cities. And they also have 800 number lists. They have, they all got stung from this shock of not realizing they'd be gone for months and some people years from New Orleans. But in those first few months too, business owners really first and foremost found their families if they weren't already together. But then after that, long before they were ready to put their businesses back up, the next thing they did was they found their employees, right? They cared. And you get a sense of the type of boss, a type A or type B boss, or a theory X or theory Y boss. They cared. The next step was, my family's okay, how are my employees doing? And not because they were worried about getting back online and making money in that second, but because these were the real people they were dealing with. And they were really stung because some employees they didn't find for months because they didn't have that technology. So a lot of places have learned from that. A lot of organizations have gotten the resilience planning bug and try to create resilience policies, but they're theoretical, and I'm starting to actually code for that too, to assess what companies are actually doing, and there's a lot of variation and no standard form. And when I go to policy conferences, the resilience officers that are doing the job of resilience often ask me, can I have a network checklist? Like, what should my checklist look like? But now you know, even from like the Croatia story where you saw different networks over time, or the way in which the network blows up after Katrina, there's not a straight answer in a checklist. It's more of understanding the nuances of what you need at various different points in time, at various different points of uncertainty.
I'm thinking of some of the elements of other examples that might have happened since the Katrina example, which was the Katrina example was your most recent one.
In terms of field work, no, Sandy is the more recent in terms of hurricanes that I've looked at. Okay. Yeah.
One of the things that I'm thinking of are situations that are volatile and there's an aftermath, and the technology that's added has a lot of multimedia.
Yes.
So what you've looked in so far hasn't been so much multimedia.
Yes, that's right. That picture right there is Twitter.
And not only multimedia, but then also multimedia that's ephemeral now.
Uh-huh.
So Snapchat and Vine, well, not Vine so much, but you know that idea.
And after Sandy, we're just starting to analyze the tweets and the issues, and we actually have some surveys on how people use new media like Twitter. And right now, early results show that it was noise. It was very hard, actually, to differentiate And actually, first responders and emergency personnel now use Twitter strategically, and they've now learned to date their tweet, because in like post-Sandy, which was 2012, a tweet would get repeated so many times, and it started getting old, and it was no longer accurate. So it created this. It looked more like this, where there was a lot of noise in the system, instead of being able to parse out actually something useful and informative. We're chasing it though too, right? The more we learn from these past experiences, the more you all are learning how to use the technologies too and do a better job managing the noise. And so it's a little bit of a moving target in trying to understand that. Hi.
Hi, I'm an international relations major, and I'm part of William & Mary's undergraduate think tank program, foreign policy think tank program. And one of the people in this program is writing a white paper right now on the structure of terrorist organizations. And his argument is that terrorist groups are evolving from a hierarchical structure to sort of a decentralized network, and eventually in the future could move more to a network or a structure more like anonymous, where you have a highly decentralized network of groups of people who only know each other online, have never even met in real life, and could pop up and sort of commit lone wolf acts of terrorism. And his argument is
we're
that those,
seeing that already.
And his argument is that those kinds of organizations would actually be more resilient because you wouldn't be able to take out a high value target. So I'm curious to hear your thoughts on whether that analysis is correct and squares with your experience.
It's a really good question, and he's probably found so much data and information on it that he doesn't know what to do with it all, because there are a lot of network and organization scholars studying this. And in fact, part of it is, I would argue that I don't know that they were ever so hierarchical as they were in a loyalty-based network structure that was very compacted. Some of the costs and benefits of a more dispersed and decentralized network, like you described, is that you start losing a central message, right? And so there's more room for all of those different terrorist cells, to really fight for something else. And when you lose a central message, you can lose some of the power that comes with being a network. One of the scholars that has thought about this a bit is a guy named Lance Bennett at University of Washington, your alma mater. Yeah. And so that's actually absolutely right in terms of those decentralized cells. Now it's harder for anyone to take out the whole network because they keep popping up. And those are considered rhizome structures. And if you ever had ginger, have you ever eaten ginger root or seen what ginger is? A rhizome structure, if you know anything about plants, some plants are rhizome-based, meaning their root systems can keep perpetuating all throughout underneath the ground. And if you take out part of it, the plant still doesn't die because there's not a central hub of life. And these terrorist networks are these rhizome structures. But it starts diluting a core central message and hate and otherness. Yet at the same time, we're starting to see these somewhat effective terrorist events happening, right? Where we're terrified that there's going to be a car blowing up or just some random shooter come out, and the Taliban or ISIS or whomever is taking credit for it. So now it becomes a matter of PR too. They want to take credit for it. But part of the information wars I'm starting to observe, and I'm talking off my knowledge as a social network scholar and observation and a little bit of knowledge about this, is I feel like we're starting to see an information war where ISIS tries to take credit for a terror event. And then the response of the governments is to deny it and say, no, this was just a random act. So they can't get the credit, which then hurts the ISIS reputation, right? And so it becomes a public relations war in some ways as well. And I have no evidence to support that. I don't know the governments who are denying that it's ISIS or not, but it sure would make sense to me, like it would be a really strategic way to respond to that, because we don't want to give them credit for having power over us and having their actions making us feel afraid in our own homes and so forth. Good question, though. Good luck to him.
One more question?
And another person, Steve Corman at Arizona State University has a whole center on networks and terrorism. And networks, if you think about so understanding social networks so well, on the one hand, it's really exciting. We learn how to leverage resources. On the other hand, we learn also how terrorists can leverage resources, right? There's a yin and yang to it, much like nuclear physics, right? You learn nuclear medicine that saves lives, but we also have nuclear bombs, right? These are some really interesting tensions in science that we have in discovery that we want to learn, but then it also means underneath that, we really have to talk about ethics at every step of the way too as we learn these discoveries.
One more question.
I'll speak loudly.
Sure.
No, this
Oh,
has
no,
to
they
be
want
done.
it on tape. You're on record now.
Okay.
You can't deny it.
So you are looking at networks in extreme environments of underconfidence. And so my question would be, do you see similar patterns in organizations that are at peak confidence that would then be indicative of a looming crisis? What did the network at Lehman Brothers look like before everything hit the
Don't we
skates?
wish we could know, because I've had students that want to study the stockbrokers. We live less than an hour from New York City. No one will tell you their networks. They don't, they know their networks are tight, right? But maybe I'll shift it over to a little bit different type of an organization. High reliability organizations are very interested. So for example, oil rigs, in the middle of the sea, those are high reliability organizations. Nothing can go wrong with them. And it's actually where Carl Weick started his work in terms of thinking about resilience in the 90s, is studying these high reliability organizations and what does resilience look like. And it is where, with this little thing, where robustness, resourcefulness, redundancy, and rapidity come from a few of us together. But Weick is one of the original thinkers on this line. But I'm also turning the corner, because now we're starting to see in disaster response and in these highly volatile contexts, there are a lot of organizations that need to have real plans. And so we're actually, another arm of my work with the engineer and computer scientists that I'm collaborating with, is we're trying to find funding to study seaports. Seaports which run the risk of cyber attacks are highly important infrastructures to the United States. So for example, when the Port of New Orleans went out and they were offline for about, I think really like 4 or 6 months. No, they were offline for like 2 months. Their big concern was, they're the number 3 port in the country. If the Port of New Orleans is down, how does Chicago get their diapers? Like, they're dealing with everyday issues, but they end up being these really important organizations. So they are too, these infrastructure organizations. And National Science Foundation has been rolling out this resilience award every year, that they have like $20 million or so in funding to support resilience research, so we can answer just exactly what you're asking. Because a lot of folks too are doing these tabletop games and trying to do simulations and scenarios to test out if the resilience planning would actually play out in various different conditions, and they don't really know. The science isn't there yet. But there's a lot of money in it. Last year, that NSF award was a $20 million commitment, and 6 university teams got that $20 million. Very competitive, high-profile stuff.
Well, thank you very, very much.
Thank you. Thank you for your attention.
Yeah, thank you.
All right. I should.